Book Talk begins at 7 minutes and 35 seconds.
Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania.
Episode 636. Happy Fountain Pen Day. This episode of CraftLit was brought to you by our supporters at Patreon. This week, we would like to thank Diana Jablonski, Donna Moore, Nina, Julie, Yanlei, and a new patron from last week, Linda C. Hayden. Thank you so much for your support. We truly could not do this without you. So thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I'm actually better today. I don't want to say that too loudly because evil eye and all that, but I am feeling better today. So that's something new. I would like to announce our raffle winner. This is for Tracee's beautiful pink flowery happy making planner. And the winner is Jennifer Lindberg. I should have already emailed you by now. So if you haven't gotten that email, check your spam folder and see if you got something from Heather Ordover. And congratulations. I hope you really enjoy this as much as I do. Well, I got a message from Diane yesterday that there are only 6 seats left on our tour to Sweden and Denmark for May 2024. And as promised, I was going to let you know a little bit more about what's going on. This would be after we are done with our big dinner in Copenhagen. The next day we do a guided tour, which is always lovely because Diane hooks us up with the best and funniest guides that you could possibly find. It's fantastic. So after we get to see kind of the big picture of Copenhagen, then we go to the Royal Danish Library, and we're going specifically to the Black Diamond, which sounds kind of dicey, like the Star Chamber or something like that, but it's not. It's just that architecturally, it is a big black diamond. It's really cool. We'll have a picture of it in the show notes so you can take a look. That is craftlit.com/636. And one of the things that we should be able to see while we are at said diamond is a copy of the Gutenberg Bible, which it's old. Tell me something I didn't know, Heather. I will tell you after I go in May 2024 with you. After we get a chance to see the Bible, we will head north to Karen Blixen's museum. You may recall Karen Blixen is the woman who wrote the book that became the movie Out of Africa. And she's a fascinating person, as is Beryl Markham, who was the young kind of hotshot pilot who does show up in the movie. Her book, is it Into the Night? West with the Night? I read it like 30 years ago, so I don't remember. I'm impressed that I remembered Beryl Markham. And then after we get a chance to tootle around and take a look at Karen Blixen's family home and museum, we will move again north to Kronborg Castle. This thing is massive. It's so big. And like many of these buildings from a long, long time ago, portions of it have gotten burnt down and been rebuilt, but it's all just stunning. It's one of those places where I really have a sneaking suspicion that you can't photograph it really. I mean, you can photograph parts of it, obviously, but getting the whole vibe of the place is not something that you can do. And in fact, that point was really driven home to me when I was looking at pictures and videos. And I thought, this is really interesting because I don't remember this being the Castle Elsinore in Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet. And I would have kind of expected that they would have filmed it in Kronborg Castle because it is Danish and it is the inspiration for the Castle Elsinore in the play Hamlet. But it wasn't. I think he filmed it at the Blenheim Estate, which was the Churchill's home. And I believe, if I am not mistaken, that Churchill called it the coldest place to grow up, period, full stop. And if you ever get a chance to go see Blenheim, Churchill was right. There is something about that place that is just big and cold. I don't know if it's an overabundance of marble or what, but I mean, it's beautiful in an austere kind of way, but it's not funky and fun looking like Kronborg. So I'm really excited that we get to go see Kronborg. And if that wasn't enough, that evening we take a ferry across to Helsingborg, Sweden. And that is where we will stay for that night, the night of day 4. And next week, I'll tell you a little bit about what happens on day 5. Don't forget that, like I said, there are only 6 seats left on this tour. There are lovely people at Holiday Travels that you can speak to about putting a deposit in and saving yourself a seat, just to be on the safe side. And then you can talk to them about how to pay, by when, and all of that. And up until the date that the final payment is due, that deposit is fully refundable. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody situation. Holiday Travel is just really good. Their phone number, 888-554-5208. Go ahead and call them and let them know that you are interested in exploring the arts and literature of Denmark and Sweden with CraftLit. Alrighty, today I'm going to play you 3 chapters. The last one is the longest one. Chapter 39 today is kind of a lightweight chapter. It brings us up to date on some people. There's still mystery there and romance, but we see kind of chess pieces moving on the board. Chapter 40 is fabulous. And if you are listening to the John Lee version, you will hear him chew and enjoy his words as he is speaking the language of Cardinal Richelieu. In fact, if I can, I'm going to try and record the recording so we can play a little clip for you on the flip side. The 3rd chapter we're listening to today is not as important militarily as you might think it's going to be. Really, it's just discovering more intrigue and seeing the real danger that our protagonists can get themselves into. So, a couple things just to note in advance. There is a play called Mirame, a tragedy in 5 acts. There is a reference to it at the very, very end of chapter 39. This is a play that Richelieu was allegedly the author of, but in actuality, it was more likely a poet. I think his last name is Saint-Saurin. And it's not that Richelieu didn't have anything to do with the writing of the play. It was just that he was probably more of a contributor, a suggester, than an actual writer. In chapter 40, like I said, listen very closely to Richelieu's dialogue. You get so much character information from this one moment, this one meeting. And it's important, it's really important to pay attention anytime we get a chance to hear Richelieu. The first time we really heard him was with Monsieur Bonancieux, which was awesome because he just ate the guy alive. Today, you're going to see a different manipulative side to him, and it's just luscious writing. Again, Dumas and the theater, it's all over this place. You will hear a reference to an arquebus, Arquebus. This was the first portable firearm. And when I say portable, I mean portable the way that phones were portable in 1985, which means not really. You had to have a big metal fork that you rested the gun in. It was a matchlock gun, so it was basically a slightly mobile cannon. The French army at least had it in use from 1525 to 1630, so that lasted for quite some time. So it must have been, working. You're going to hear a phrase used that I don't think I've heard used this way, that to precipitate herself would be to kill herself. Just so you know, in case you haven't heard that usage before either. You're going to hear a quick reference to Joan of Arc, so you can wave and say hello as we pass by. Don't forget, the Huguenots were the Calvinist Protestants who were allied with the English, which means they're allied with Buckingham, and they have been in the city of La Rochelle for a while now. That is the battle that we are heading into in our final chapter today, the Siege of La Rochelle. And I'm pretty sure I have brought it up before, but there is that painting of Richelieu on the barricade, the seawall, that is stupendously well designed and orchestrated. Just the color and the way that it focuses your eyes. If you've never taken an art history class, this painting will tell you pretty much everything that you're supposed to do. If you want to do it right. It's lovely. It's one of the paintings that I would love to see in person someday. Also a reminder, the Edict of Nantes, Nantes, 1598. This was Henry IV, Henry IV's official statement of his tolerance of Protestants living in France. So it's a big deal, and it would be a big deal if it was, for example, lost or ignored or replaced by something less tolerant. And aside from that, the only other thing I wanted to give you a heads up about was Madame de Sévigné, which is probably absolutely not how you pronounce it, but it is Sevigne. She is referred to like you should know who she is, and that's because she wound up being a writer herself, funny writer. And her letters, I think, to her daughters and husband turned out to have been very detailed in daily life, which, as we know, is not something that got recorded very frequently when it was the day of women's daily life. So she wound up becoming a person worth reading, which is why, again, Dumas would be kind of promoting her to all the readers. Like, maybe you should go and take a look at what she did if you've only ever heard of her but never read her. And aside from that, just know that all of the human people who are mentioned by name are real, and they did what Dumas said that they did pretty much accurately. Outside of the named people, I am not going to guarantee accuracy. Let's listen to chapters 39, 40, and 41 of The Three Musketeers, written by Alexandre Dumas. If you are listening to your own version, you can tune back in at
1 hour, 22 minutes, and 14 seconds.
And then I'll catch you on the flip side. Here we go.
Chapter 39 of the D'Artagnan Romances, Volume 1, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, translated by William Robson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Vision. At 4 o'clock, the four friends were all assembled with Athos. Their anxiety about their outfits had all disappeared, and each countenance only preserved the expression of its own secret disquiet, for behind all present happiness is concealed a fear for the future. Suddenly, Planchet entered, bringing 2 letters for D'Artagnan. The one was a little billet, genteelly folded, with a pretty seal in green wax on which was impressed a dove bearing a green branch. The other was a large square epistle, resplendent with the terrible arms of His Eminence the Cardinal Duke. At the sight of the little letter, the heart of D'Artagnan bounded, for he believed he recognized the handwriting, and although he had seen that writing but once, the memory of it remained at the bottom of his heart. He therefore seized the little epistle and opened it eagerly. "Be," said the letter, "on Thursday next, at from 6 to 7 o'clock in the evening, on the road to Chaillot, and look carefully into the carriages that pass. But if you have any consideration for your own life, or that of those who love you, do not speak a single word, do not make a movement which may lead anyone to believe you have recognized her who exposes herself to everything for the sake of seeing you but for an instant. No signature." "That's a snare," said Athos. "Don't go, D'Artagnan." "And yet," replied D'Artagnan, "I think I recognize the writing." "It may be counterfeit," said Athos. "Between 6 and 7 o'clock, the road of Chaillot is quite deserted. You might as well go and ride in the forest of Bondy." "But suppose we all go?" said D'Artagnan. "What the devil! They won't devour us all four lackeys, horses, arms and all."
"And besides, it will be a chance for displaying our new equipments," said Porthos.
"But if it is a woman who writes," said Aramis, "and that woman desires not to be seen, remember, you compromise her, D'Artagnan, which is not the part of a gentleman."
"We will remain in the background," said Porthos, "and he will advance alone."
"Yes, but a pistol shot is easily fired from a carriage which goes at a gallop."
"Bah!" said D'Artagnan. "They will miss me. If they fire, we will ride after the carriage and exterminate those who may be in it. They must be enemies." "He is right," said Porthos. "Battle. Besides, we must try our own arms."
"Bah! Let us enjoy that pleasure," said Aramis with his mild and careless manner. "As you please," said Athos.
"Gentlemen," said D'Artagnan, "it is 4:30, and we have scarcely time to be on the road of Chaillot by 6.
"Besides, if we go out too late, nobody will see us," said Porthos, "and that will be a pity. Let us get ready, gentlemen."
"But this second letter," said Athos. "You forget that. It appears to me, however, that the seal denotes that it deserves to be opened. For my part, I declare, D'Artagnan, I think it of much more consequence than the little piece of waste paper you have so cunningly slipped into your bosom."
D'Artagnan blushed. "Well," said he, "let us see, gentlemen. What are His Eminence's commands?" And D'Artagnan unsealed the letter and read, "Monsieur D'Artagnan of the King's Guards, Company des Essarts, is expected at the Palais Cardinal this evening at 8 o'clock. La Houdinière, captain of the Guards."
"The devil!" said Athos. "Here's a rendezvous much more serious than the other."
"I will go to the second after attending the first," said D'Artagnan. "One is for 7 o'clock, and the other for 8. There will be time for both."
"I would not go at all," said Aramis. "A gallant knight cannot decline a rendezvous with a lady, but a prudent gentleman may excuse himself from not waiting on His Eminence, particularly when he has reason to believe he is not invited to make his compliments."
"I am of Aramis's opinion,"
said Porthos. "Gentlemen," replied D'Artagnan, "I have already received by Monsieur de Cavois a similar invitation from His Eminence. I neglected it, and on the morrow a serious misfortune happened to me. Constance disappeared. Whatever may ensue, I will go."
"If you are determined," said Athos, Do so.
But the Bastille, said Aramis.
Bah! You will get me out if they put me there, said D'Artagnan.
To be sure we will,
replied Aramis and Porthos, with admirable promptness and decision, as if that were the simplest thing in the world.
To be sure we will get you out. But meantime, as we are to set off the day after tomorrow, you would do much better not to risk this Bastille.
Let us do better than that, said Athos. Do not let us leave him during the whole evening. Let each of us wait at a gate of the palace, with 3 Musketeers behind him. If we see a closed carriage, at all suspicious in appearance, come out, let us fall upon it. It is a long time since we have had a skirmish with the guards of Monsieur the Cardinal. Monsieur de Tréville must think us dead.
To a certainty, Athos, said Aramis. You were meant to be a general of the army. What do you think of the plan, gentlemen?
Admirable, replied the young men in chorus.
Well, said Porthos, I will run to the hotel and engage our comrades to hold themselves in readiness by 8 o'clock. The rendezvous, the Place du Palais Cardinal. Meantime, you see that the lackeys saddle the horses.
I have no horse, said D'Artagnan, but that is of no consequence. I can take one of Monsieur de Tréville's.
That is not worth while, said Aramis. You can have one of mine.
One of yours? How many have you, then? asked D'Artagnan.
3,
replied Aramis, smiling.
Certes, cried Athos, you are the best mounted poet of France or Navarre.
Well, my dear Aramis, you don't want 3 horses. I cannot comprehend what induced you to buy 3.
Therefore I only purchased 2, said Aramis.
The 3rd, then, fell from the clouds, I suppose?
No, the 3rd was brought to me this very morning by a groom out of livery, who would not tell me in whose service he was, and who said he had received orders from his master.
Or mistress, interrupted D'Artagnan.
That makes no difference, said Aramis, coloring, and who affirmed, as I said, that he had received orders from his master or mistress to place the horse in my stable, without informing me whence it came.
It is only to poets that such things happen, said Athos gravely. Well, in that case, we can manage famously, said D'Artagnan. Which of the 2 horses will you ride, that which you bought, or the one that was given to you?
That which was given to me, assuredly. You cannot for a moment imagine, D'Artagnan, that I would commit such an offense toward—
The unknown giver, interrupted D'Artagnan.
Or the mysterious benefactress, said Athos.
The one you bought will then become useless to you?
Nearly so.
And you selected it yourself?
With the greatest care. The safety of the horseman, you know, depends almost always upon the goodness of his horse.
Well, transfer it to me at the price it cost you.
I was going to make you the offer, my dear D'Artagnan, giving you all the time necessary for repaying me such a trifle.
How much did it cost you?
800 livres.
Here are the 40 double pistoles, my friend, said D'Artagnan, taking the sum from his pocket. I know that is the coin in which you were paid for your poems.
You are rich, then?
said Aramis. Rich? Richest, my dear fellow! And D'Artagnan chinked the remainder of his pistoles in his pocket.
Send your saddle, then, to the Hotel of the Musketeers, and your horse can be brought back with ours.
Very well, but it is already 5 o'clock, so make haste. A quarter of an hour afterward, Porthos appeared at the end of the Rue Ferou on a very handsome genet. Mousqueton followed him upon an Auvergne horse, small but very handsome. Porthos was resplendent with joy and pride. At the same time, Aramis made his appearance at the other end of the street upon a superb English charger. Bazin followed him upon a roan, holding by the halter a vigorous Mecklenburg horse. This was D'Artagnan's mount. The two Musketeers met at the gate. Athos and D'Artagnan watched their approach from the window. "The devil!" cried Aramis. "You have a magnificent horse there, Porthos."
"Yes," replied Porthos. "It is one that ought to have been sent to me at first. A bad joke of the husband's substituted the other, but the husband has been punished since, and I have obtained full satisfaction."
Planchet and Grimaud appeared in their turn, leading their master's steeds. D'Artagnan and Athos put themselves into saddle with their companions, and all four set forward. Athos upon a horse he owed to a woman, Aramis on a horse he owed to his mistress, Porthos on a horse he owed to his procurator's wife, and D'Artagnan on a horse he owed to his good fortune, the best mistress possible. The lackeys followed. As Porthos had foreseen, the cavalcade produced a good effect, and if Madame Coquenard had met Porthos and seen what a superb appearance he made upon his handsome Spanish genet, she would not have regretted the bleeding she had inflicted upon the strong-box of her husband. Near the Louvre, the four friends met with Monsieur de Tréville, who was returning from Saint-Germain. He stopped them to offer his compliments upon their appointments, which in an instant drew round them 100 gapers. D'Artagnan profited by the circumstance to speak to Monsieur de Tréville of the letter with the great red seal and the cardinal's arms. It is well understood that he did not breathe a word about the other. Monsieur de Tréville approved of the resolution he had adopted, and assured him that if on the morrow he did not appear, he himself would undertake to find him, let him be where he might. At this moment, the clock of La Samaritaine struck 6. The four friends pleaded an engagement and took leave of Monsieur de Tréville. A short gallop brought them to the road of Chaillot. The day began to decline. Carriages were passing and repassing. D'Artagnan, keeping at some distance from his friends, darted a scrutinizing glance into every carriage that appeared, but saw no face with which he was acquainted. At length, after waiting a quarter of an hour, and just as twilight was beginning to thicken, a carriage appeared, coming at a quick pace on the road of Sèvres. A presentiment instantly told D'Artagnan that this carriage contained the person who had appointed the rendezvous. The young man was himself astonished to find his heart beat so violently. Almost instantly a female head was put out at the window, with 2 fingers placed upon her mouth, either to enjoin silence or to send him a kiss. D'Artagnan uttered a slight cry of joy. This woman, or rather this apparition, for the carriage passed with the rapidity of a vision, was Madame Bonacieux. By an involuntary movement, and in spite of the injunction given, D'Artagnan put his horse into a gallop, and in a few strides overtook the carriage. But the window was hermetically closed. The vision had disappeared. D'Artagnan then remembered the injunction, "If you value your own life, or that of those who love you, remain motionless and as if you had seen nothing." He stopped, therefore, trembling not for himself, but for the poor woman who had evidently exposed herself to great danger by appointing this rendezvous. The carriage pursued its way, still going at a great pace, till it dashed into Paris and disappeared. D'Artagnan remained fixed to the spot, astounded and not knowing what to think. If it was Madame Bonacieux, and if she was returning to Paris, why this fugitive rendezvous? Why this simple exchange of a glance? Why this lost kiss? If, on the other side, it was not she, which was still quite possible, for the little light that remained rendered a mistake easy, might it not be the commencement of some plot against him through the allurement of this woman, for whom his love was known? His 3 companions joined him. All had plainly seen a woman's head appear at the window, but none of them, except Athos, knew Madame Bonacieux. The opinion of Athos was that it was indeed she, but less preoccupied by that pretty face than D'Artagnan, he had fancied he saw a second head, a man's head, inside the carriage.
"If that be the case," said D'Artagnan, "they are doubtless transporting her from one prison to another. But what can they intend to do with the poor creature? And how shall I ever meet her again?" "Friend," said Athos gravely, "remember that it is the dead alone with whom we are not likely to meet again on this earth. You know something of that as well as I do, I think. Now, if your mistress is not dead, if it is she we have just seen, you will meet with her again some day or other, and perhaps, my God," added he, with that misanthropic tone which was peculiar to him, "perhaps sooner than you wish." 7:30 had sounded. The carriage had been 20 minutes behind the time appointed. D'Artagnan's friends reminded him that he had a visit to pay, but at the same time bade him observe that there was yet time to retract. But D'Artagnan was at the same time impetuous and curious. He had made up his mind that he would go to the Palais Cardinal, and that he would learn what his Eminence had to say to him. Nothing could turn him from his purpose. They reached the Rue Saint-Honore, and in the Place du Palais Cardinal they found the 12 invited Musketeers walking about in expectation of their comrades. There only they explained to them the matter in hand. D'Artagnan was well known among the honorable corps of the King's Musketeers, in which it was known he would one day take his place. He was considered beforehand as a comrade. It resulted from these antecedents that everyone entered heartily into the purpose for which they met. Besides, it would not be unlikely that they would have an opportunity of playing either the cardinal or his people an ill turn, and for such expeditions these worthy gentlemen were always ready. Athos divided them into 3 groups, assumed the command of one, gave the second to Aramis and the third to Porthos, and then each group went and took their watch near an entrance. D'Artagnan, on his part, entered boldly at the principal gate. Although he felt himself ably supported, the young man was not without a little uneasiness as he ascended the great staircase, step by step. His conduct toward Milady bore a strong resemblance to treachery, and he was very suspicious of the political relations which existed between that woman and the cardinal. Still further, De Wardes, whom he had treated so ill, was one of the tools of his Eminence, and D'Artagnan knew that while his Eminence was terrible to his enemies, he was strongly attached to his friends. "If De Wardes has related all our affair to the cardinal, which is not to be doubted, and if he has recognized me, as is probable, I may consider myself almost as a condemned man," said D'Artagnan, shaking his head. "But why has he waited till now? That's all plain enough. Milady has laid her complaints against me with that hypocritical grief which renders her so interesting, and this last offense has made the cup overflow. Fortunately," added he, "my good friends are down yonder, and they will not allow me to be carried away without a struggle. Nevertheless, Monsieur de Tréville's company of Musketeers alone cannot maintain a war against the cardinal, who disposes of the forces of all France, and before whom the queen is without power, and the king without will. D'Artagnan, my friend, you are brave, you are prudent, you have excellent qualities, but the women will ruin you." He came to this melancholy conclusion as he entered the antechamber. He placed his letter in the hands of the usher on duty, who led him into the waiting room and passed on into the interior of the palace. In this waiting room were 5 or 6 of the cardinal's guards, who recognized D'Artagnan, and knowing that it was he who had wounded Jussac, they looked upon him with a smile of singular meaning. This smile appeared to D'Artagnan to be of bad augury. Only as our Gascon was not easily intimidated, or rather, thanks to a great pride natural to the men of his country, he did not allow one easily to see what was passing in his mind when that which was passing at all resembled fear. He placed himself haughtily in front of Messieurs the Guards, and waited with his hand on his hip, in an attitude by no means deficient in majesty. The usher returned and made a sign to D'Artagnan to follow him. It appeared to the young man that the guards, on seeing him depart, chuckled among themselves. He traversed a corridor, crossed a grand saloon, entered a library, and found himself in the presence of a man seated at a desk and writing. The usher introduced him and retired without speaking a word. D'Artagnan remained standing and examined this man. D'Artagnan at first believed that he had to do with some judge examining his papers, but he perceived that the man at the desk wrote, or rather corrected, lines of unequal length, scanning the words on his fingers. He saw then that he was with a poet. At the end of an instant the poet closed his manuscript, upon the cover of which was written, "Meram, a tragedy in 5 acts," and raised his head. D'Artagnan recognized the Cardinal. End of chapter 39. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 40 of the D'Artagnan Romances, Volume 1, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, translated by William Robson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A terrible vision. The cardinal leaned his elbow on his manuscript, his cheek upon his hand, and looked intently at the young man for a moment. No one had a more searching eye than the Cardinal de Richelieu, and D'Artagnan felt this glance run through his veins like a fever. He, however, kept a good countenance, holding his hat in his hand and awaiting the good pleasure of his Eminence, without too much assurance, but also without too much humility. "Monsieur," said the cardinal, "are you a D'Artagnan from Béarn?" "Yes, monseigneur," replied the young man. "There are several branches of the D'Artagnans at Tarbes and in its environs," said the cardinal. "To which do you belong?" "I am the son of him who served in the religious wars under the great King Henry, the father of his gracious Majesty." "That is well. It is you who set out 7 or 8 months ago from your country to seek your fortune in the capital?" "Yes, monseigneur." "You came through Meung, where something befell you. I don't very well know what, but still something." "Monseigneur," said D'Artagnan, "this was what happened to me." Never mind," resumed the cardinal, with a smile which indicated that he knew the story as well as he who wished to relate it. "You were recommended to Monsieur de Tréville, were you not?" "Yes, monseigneur, but in that unfortunate affair at Meung—" "The letter was lost," replied his Eminence. "Yes, I know that. But Monsieur de Tréville is a skilled physiognomist, who knows men at first sight, and he placed you in the company of his brother-in-law, Monsieur Dessessart, leaving you to hope that one day or other you should enter the Musketeers." "Monseigneur is correctly informed," said D'Artagnan. "Since that time many things have happened to you. You were walking one day behind the Chartreux, when it would have been better if you had been elsewhere. Then you took with your friends a journey to the waters of Forges. They stopped on the road, but you continued yours. That is all very simple. You had business in England." "Monseigneur," said D'Artagnan, quite confused, "I went—" "Hunting at Windsor or elsewhere. That concerns nobody. I know because it is my office to know everything. On your return you were received by an august personage, and I perceive with pleasure that you preserve the souvenir she gave you." D'Artagnan placed his hand upon the queen's diamond, which he wore, and quickly turned the stone inward, but it was too late. "The day after that, you received a visit from Cavois," resumed the cardinal. "He went to desire you to come to my palace. You have not returned that visit, and you were wrong." "Monseigneur, I feared I had incurred disgrace with your Eminence." "How could that be, monsieur? Could you incur my displeasure by having followed the orders of your superiors with more intelligence and courage than another would have done? It is the people who do not obey that I punish, and not those who, like you, obey but too well. As a proof, remember the date of the day on which I had you bidden to come to me, and seek in your memory for what happened to you that very night."
That was the very evening when the abduction of Madame Bonacieux took place. D'Artagnan trembled, and he likewise recollected that during the past half-hour the poor woman had passed close to him, without doubt carried away by the same power that had caused her disappearance. "In short," continued the cardinal, "as I have heard nothing of you for some time past, I wished to know what you were doing. Besides, you owe me some thanks. You must yourself have remarked how much you have been considered in all the circumstances." D'Artagnan bowed with respect. "That," continued the cardinal, "arose not only from a feeling of natural equity, but likewise from a plan I have marked out with respect to you." D'Artagnan became more and more astonished. "I wished to explain this plan to you on the day you received my first invitation, but you did not come. Fortunately, nothing is lost by this delay, and you are now about to hear it. Sit down, there, before me, D'Artagnan. You are a gentleman enough not to listen standing." And the cardinal pointed with his finger to a chair for the young man, who was so astonished at what was passing that he awaited a second sign from his interlocutor before he obeyed. "You are brave, Monsieur d'Artagnan," continued his Eminence. "You are prudent, which is still better. I like men of head and heart. Don't be afraid," said he, smiling. "By men of heart, I mean men of courage. But young as you are, and scarcely entering into the world, you have powerful enemies. If you do not take great heed, they will destroy you." "Alas, Monseigneur," replied the young man, "very easily, no doubt, for they are strong and well supported, while I am alone." "Yes, that's true. But alone as you are, you have done much already, and will do still more, I don't doubt. Yet you have need, I believe, to be guided in the adventurous career you have undertaken. For, if I mistake not, you came to Paris with the ambitious idea of making your fortune." "I am at the age of extravagant hopes, Monseigneur," said D'Artagnan. "There are no extravagant hopes but for fools, monsieur, and you are a man of understanding. Now, what would you say to an ensign's commission in my guards, and a company after their campaign?" "Ah, Monseigneur!" "You accept it, do you not?" "Monseigneur!" replied D'Artagnan with an embarrassed air. "How? You refuse?" cried the cardinal with astonishment. "I am in His Majesty's guard, Monseigneur, and I have no reason to be dissatisfied." "But it appears to me that my guards, mine, are also His Majesty's guards, and whoever serves in a French corps serves the king." "Monseigneur, your Eminence has ill understood my words." "You want a pretext, do you not? I comprehend. Well, you have this excuse: advancement, the opening campaign, the opportunity which I offer you. So much for the world. As regards yourself, the need of protection. For it is fit you should know, Monsieur d'Artagnan, that I have received heavy and serious complaints against you. You do not consecrate your days and nights wholly to the king's service." D'Artagnan colored. "In fact," said the cardinal, placing his hand upon a bundle of papers, "I have here a whole pile which concerns you. I know you to be a man of resolution, and your services well directed, instead of leading you to ill, might be very advantageous to you. Come, reflect, and decide." "Your goodness confounds me, Monseigneur," replied D'Artagnan.
and I am conscious of a greatness of soul in your Eminence that makes me mean as an earthworm. But since Monseigneur permits me to speak freely—" D'Artagnan paused. "Yes, speak." "Then I will presume to say that all my friends are in the King's Musketeers and Guards, and that by an inconceivable fatality my enemies are in the service of your Eminence. I should therefore be ill received here and ill regarded there if I accepted what Monseigneur offers me." "Do you happen to entertain the haughty idea that I have not yet made you an offer equal to your value?" asked the cardinal with a smile of disdain. "Monseigneur, your Eminence is 100 times too kind to me, and on the contrary, I think I have not proved myself worthy of your goodness. The siege of La Rochelle is about to be resumed, Monseigneur. I shall serve under the eyes of your Eminence, and if I have the good fortune to conduct myself at the siege in such a manner as merits your attention, then I shall at least leave behind me some brilliant action to justify the protection with which you honor me. Everything is best in its time, Monseigneur. Hereafter, perhaps, I shall have the right of giving myself. At present, I shall appear to sell myself." "That is to say, you refuse to serve me, monsieur?" said the cardinal with a tone of vexation, through which, however, might be seen a sort of esteem. "Remain free, then, and guard your hatreds and your sympathies." "Monseigneur—" "Well, well," said the cardinal, "I don't wish you any ill, but you must be aware that it is quite trouble enough to defend and recompense our friends. We owe nothing to our enemies, and let me give you a piece of advice. Take care of yourself, Monsieur d'Artagnan, for from the moment I withdraw my hand from behind you, I would not give an obolus for your life." "I will try to do so, Monseigneur," replied the Gascon with a noble confidence. "Remember, at a later period and at a certain moment, if any mischance should happen to you," said Richelieu significantly, "that it was I who came to seek you, and that I did all in my power to prevent this misfortune befalling you." "I shall entertain, whatever may happen," said D'Artagnan, placing his hand upon his breast and bowing, "an eternal gratitude towards your Eminence for that which you now do for me." "Well, let it be then as you have said, Monsieur d'Artagnan. We shall see each other again after the campaign. I will have my eye upon you, for I shall be there," replied the cardinal, pointing with his finger to a magnificent suit of armor he was to wear. "And on our return, well, we will settle our account." "Young man," said Richelieu, "if I shall be able to say to you at another time what I have said to you today, I promise you to do so." This last expression of Richelieu's conveyed a terrible doubt. It alarmed D'Artagnan more than a menace would have done, for it was a warning. The cardinal, then, was seeking to preserve him from some misfortune which threatened him. He opened his mouth to reply, but with a haughty gesture the cardinal dismissed him. D'Artagnan went out, but at the door his heart almost failed him, and he felt inclined to return. Then the noble and severe countenance of Athos crossed his mind. If he made the compact with the cardinal which he required, Athos would no more give him his hand. Athos would renounce him. It was this fear that restrained him. So powerful is the influence of a truly great character on all that surrounds it. D'Artagnan descended by the staircase at which he had entered, and found Athos and the 4 Musketeers waiting his appearance, and beginning to grow uneasy. With a word, D'Artagnan reassured them, and Planchet ran to inform the other sentinels that it was useless to keep guard longer, as his master had come out safe from the Palais Cardinal. Returned home with Athos, Aramis and Porthos inquired eagerly the cause of the strange interview, but D'Artagnan confined himself to telling them that Monsieur de Richelieu had sent for him to propose to him to enter into his guards with the rank of ensign, and that he had refused. "And you were right," cried Aramis and Porthos with one voice. Athos fell into a profound reverie and answered nothing. But when they were alone, he said, "You have done that which you ought to have done, D'Artagnan, but perhaps you have been wrong." D'Artagnan sighed deeply, for this voice responded to a secret voice in his soul, which told him that great misfortunes awaited him. The whole of the next day was spent in preparations for departure. D'Artagnan went to take leave of M. de Tréville. At that time, it was believed that the separation of the Musketeers and the Guards would be but momentary, the king holding his parliament that very day and proposing to set out the day after. M. de Tréville contented himself with asking D'Artagnan if he could do anything for him, but D'Artagnan answered that he was supplied with all he wanted. That night brought together all those comrades of the Guards of M. Dessessart and the company of Musketeers of M. de Tréville who had been accustomed to associate together. They were parting to meet again when it pleased God, and if it pleased God. That night, then, was somewhat riotous, as may be imagined. In such cases, extreme preoccupation is only to be combated by extreme carelessness. At the first sound of the morning trumpet, the friends separated, the Musketeers hastening to the hotel of M. de Tréville, the Guards to that of M. Dessessart. Each of the captains then led his company to the Louvre, where the king held his review. The king was dull and appeared ill, which detracted a little from his usual lofty bearing. In fact, the evening before, a fever had seized him in the midst of the Parliament, while he was holding his bed of justice. He had not the less decided upon setting out that same evening, and in spite of the remonstrances that had been offered to him, he persisted in having the review, hoping by setting it at defiance to conquer the disease which began to lay hold upon him. The review over, the Guards set forward alone on their march, the Musketeers waiting for the king, which allowed Porthos time to go and take a turn in his superb equipment in the Rue aux Ours. The procurator's wife saw him pass in his new uniform and on his fine horse. She loved Porthos too dearly to allow him to part thus. She made him a sign to dismount and come to her. Porthos was magnificent. His spurs jingled, his cuirass glittered, his sword knocked proudly against his ample limbs. This time the clerks evinced no inclination to laugh. Such a real ear-clipper did Porthos appear. The Musketeer was introduced to Monsieur Coquenard, whose little gray eyes sparkled with anger at seeing his cousin all blazing new. Nevertheless, one thing afforded him inward consolation. It was expected by everybody that the campaign would be a severe one. He whispered a hope to himself that this beloved relative might be killed in the field. Porthos paid his compliments to Monsieur Coquenard and bade him farewell. Monsieur Coquenard wished him all sorts of prosperities. As to Madame Coquenard, she could not restrain her tears, but no evil impressions were taken from her grief, as she was known to be very much attached to her relatives, about whom she was constantly having serious disputes with her husband. But the real adieux were made in Madame Coquenard's chamber. They were heart-rending. As long as the procurator's wife could follow him with her eyes, she waved her handkerchief to him, leaning so far out of the window as to lead people to believe she wished to precipitate herself. Porthos received all these attentions like a man accustomed to such demonstrations. Only on turning the corner of the street, he lifted his hat gracefully and waved it to her as a sign of adieu. On his part, Aramis wrote a long letter. To whom? Nobody knew. Kitty, who was to set out that evening for Tours, was waiting in the next chamber. Athos sipped the last bottle of his Spanish wine. In the meantime, D'Artagnan was defiling with his company. Arriving at the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, he turned round to look gaily at the Bastille, but as it was the Bastille alone he looked at, he did not observe Milady, who, mounted upon a light chestnut horse, designated him with her finger to two ill-looking men who came close up to the ranks to take notice of him. To a look of interrogation which they made, Milady replied by a sign that it was he. Then, certain that there could be no mistake in the execution of her orders, she started her horse and disappeared. The two men followed the company, and on leaving the Faubourg Saint-Antoine,
mounted 2 horses properly equipped, which a servant without livery had waiting for them. End of chapter 40. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 41 of the D'Artagnan Romances, Volume 1, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, translated by William Robson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Siege of La Rochelle. The Siege of La Rochelle was one of the great political events of the reign of Louis XIII, and one of the great military enterprises of the Cardinal. It is then interesting and even necessary that we should say a few words about it, particularly as many details of the siege are connected in too important a manner with the story we have undertaken to relate, to allow us to pass it over in silence. The political plans of the Cardinal when he undertook the siege were extensive. Let us unfold them first, and then pass on to the private plans which perhaps had not less influence upon His Eminence than the others. Of the important cities given up to Henry IV to the Huguenots as places of safety, there only remained La Rochelle. It became necessary, therefore, to destroy this last bulwark of Calvinism, a dangerous leaven with which the ferments of civil revolt and foreign war were constantly mingling. Spaniards, Englishmen, and Italian malcontents, adventurers of all nations, and soldiers of fortune of every sect, flocked at the first summons under the standard of the Protestants, and organized themselves like a vast association whose branches diverged freely all over parts of Europe. La Rochelle, which had derived a new importance from the ruin of the other Calvinist cities, was then the focus of dissensions and ambition. Moreover, its port was the last in the kingdom of France open to the English, and by closing it against England, our eternal enemy, the Cardinal completed the work of Joan of Arc and the Duc de Guise. Thus, Bassompierre, who was at once Protestant and Catholic, Protestant by conviction and Catholic as commander of the Order of the Holy Ghost, Bassompierre, who was a German by birth and a Frenchman at heart, in short, Bassompierre, who had a distinguished command at the siege of La Rochelle, said in charging at the head of several other Protestant nobles like himself, "You will see, gentlemen, that we shall be fools enough to take La Rochelle." And Bassompierre was right. The cannonade of the Isle of Ré presaged to him the dragonnades of the Cevennes. The taking of La Rochelle was the preface to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. We have hinted that, by the side of these views of the leveling and simplifying minister, which belong to history, the chronicler is forced to recognize the lesser motives of the amorous man and jealous rival. Richelieu, as everyone knows, had loved the queen. Was this love a simple political affair, or was it naturally one of those profound passions which Anne of Austria inspired in those who approached her? That we are not able to say. But at all events, we have seen by the anterior developments of this story that Buckingham had the advantage over him, and in 2 or 3 circumstances, particularly that of the diamond studs, had, thanks to the devotedness of the Three Musketeers and the courage and conduct of D'Artagnan, cruelly mystified him. It was then Richelieu's object not only to get rid of an enemy of France, but to avenge himself on a rival. But this vengeance must be grand and striking and worthy in every way of a man who held in his hand, as his weapon for combat, the forces of a kingdom. Richelieu knew that in combating England he combated Buckingham, that in triumphing over England he triumphed over Buckingham. In short, that in humiliating England in the eyes of Europe he humiliated Buckingham in the eyes of the Queen. On his side, Buckingham, in pretending to maintain the honor of England, was moved by interests exactly like those of the Cardinal. Buckingham also was pursuing a private vengeance. Buckingham could not under any pretense be admitted into France as an ambassador. He wished to enter it as a conqueror. It resulted from this that the real stake in this game, which 2 most powerful kingdoms played for the good pleasure of 2 amorous men, was simply a kind look from Anne of Austria. The first advantage had been gained by Buckingham. Arriving unexpectedly in sight of the Isle of Ré with 90 vessels and nearly 20,000 men, he had surprised the Comte de Toiras,
who commanded for the king in the Isle, and he had, after a bloody conflict, effected his landing. Allow us to observe in passing that in this fight perished the Baron de Chantal, and that the Baron de Chantal left a little orphan girl 18 months old, and that this little girl was afterwards Madame de Sévigné. The Comte de Toiras retired into the citadel Saint-Martin with his garrison, and threw 100 men into a little fort called the Fort of La Prée. This event had hastened the resolutions of the cardinal until the king and he could take the command of the siege of La Rochelle, which was determined. He had sent Monsieur to direct the first operations, and had ordered all the troops he could dispose of to march toward the theater of war. It was of this detachment, sent as a vanguard, that our friend D'Artagnan formed a part. The king, as we have said, was to follow as soon as his bed of justice had been held, but on rising from his bed of justice on the 28th of June, he felt himself attacked by fever. He was, notwithstanding, anxious to set out, but his illness becoming more serious, he was forced to stop at Villeroy. Now, whenever the king halted, the Musketeers halted. It followed that D'Artagnan, who was as yet purely and simply in the Guards, found himself, for the time at least, separated from his good friends, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. This separation, which was no more than an unpleasant circumstance, would have certainly become a cause of serious uneasiness if he had been able to guess by what unknown dangers he was surrounded. He, however, arrived without accident in the camp established before La Rochelle on the 10th of the month of September of the year 1627. Everything was in the same state. The Duke of Buckingham and his English, masters of the Isle of Ré, continued to besiege, but without success, the citadel Saint-Martin and the fort of La Prée, and hostilities with La Rochelle had commenced, 2 or 3 days before, about a fort which the Duc d'Angoulême had caused to be constructed near the city. The guards under the command of Monsieur Dessessart took up their quarters at the Minimes, but, as we know, D'Artagnan, possessed with ambition to enter the Musketeers, had formed but few friendships among his comrades, and he felt himself isolated and given up to his own reflections. His reflections were not very cheerful. From the time of his arrival in Paris he had been mixed up with public affairs, but his own private affairs had made no great progress, either in love or fortune. As to love, the only woman who he could have loved was Madame Bonacieux, and Madame Bonacieux had disappeared, without his being able to discover what had become of her. As to fortune, he had made, humble as he was, an enemy of the cardinal, that is to say, of a man before whom trembled the greatest men of the kingdom, beginning with the king. That man had the power to crush him, and yet he had not done so. For a mind so perspicuous as that of D'Artagnan, this indulgence was a light by which he caught a glimpse of a better future. Then he had made himself another enemy, less to be feared, he thought, but nevertheless he instinctively felt not to be despised. This enemy was Milady. In exchange for all this, he had acquired the protection and goodwill of the queen, but the favor of the queen was at the present time an additional cause of persecution, and her protection, as it was known, protected badly, as witness Chalais and Madame Bonacieux. What he had clearly gained in all this was the diamond, worth 5,000 or 6,000 livres, which he wore on his finger, and even this diamond, supposing that D'Artagnan in his projects of ambition wished to keep it, to make it some day a pledge for the gratitude of the queen, had not in the meanwhile, since he could not part with it, more value than the gravel he trod under his feet. We say the gravel he trod under his feet, for D'Artagnan made these reflections while walking solitarily along a pretty little road which led from the camp to the village of Angoulême. Now, these reflections had led him further than he intended, and the day was beginning to decline when, by the last ray of the setting sun, he thought he saw the barrel of a musket glitter from behind a hedge. D'Artagnan had a quick eye and a prompt understanding. He comprehended that the musket had not come there of itself, and that he who bore it had not concealed himself behind a hedge with any friendly intentions. He determined, therefore, to direct his course as clear from it as he could, when, on the opposite side of the road, from behind a rock,
he perceived the extremity of another musket. This was evidently an ambuscade. The young man cast a glance at the first musket and saw with a certain degree of inquietude that it was leveled in his direction. But as soon as he perceived that the orifice of the barrel was motionless, he threw himself upon the ground. At the same instant the gun was fired, and he heard the whistling of a ball pass over his head. No time was to be lost. D'Artagnan sprang up with a bound, and at the same instant the ball from the other musket tore up the gravel on the very spot on the road where he had thrown himself with his face to the ground. D'Artagnan was not one of those foolhardy men who seek a ridiculous death in order that it may be said of them that they did not retreat a single step. Besides, courage was out of the question here. D'Artagnan had fallen into an ambush. "If there is a third shot," said he to himself, "I am a lost man." He immediately, therefore, took to his heels and ran toward the camp, with the swiftness of the young men of his country, so renowned for their agility. But whatever might be his speed, the first who fired, having had time to reload, fired a second shot, and this time so well aimed that it struck his hat and carried it 10 paces from him. As he, however, had no other hat, he picked up this as he ran and arrived at his quarters very pale and quite out of breath. He sat down without saying a word to anybody and began to reflect. This event might have 3 causes. The first and the most natural was that it might be an ambuscade of the Rochelle, who might not be sorry to kill one of His Majesty's guards because it would be an enemy the less, and this enemy might have a well-furnished purse in his pocket. D'Artagnan took his hat, examined the hole made by the ball, and shook his head. The ball was not a musket ball, it was an arquebus ball. The accuracy of the aim had first given him the idea that a special weapon had been employed. This could not, then, be a military ambuscade, as the ball was not of the regular caliber. This might be a kind remembrance of Monsieur the Cardinal. It may be observed that at the very moment when, thanks to the ray of the sun, he perceived the gun barrel, he was thinking with astonishment on the forbearance of His Eminence with respect to him. But D'Artagnan again shook his head. For people toward whom he had but to put forth his hand, His Eminence had rarely recourse to such means. It might be a vengeance of Milady. That was most probable. He tried in vain to remember the faces or dress of the assassins. He had escaped so rapidly that he had not had leisure to notice anything. "Ah, my poor friends," murmured D'Artagnan, "where are you, and that you should fail me?" D'Artagnan passed a very bad night. 3 or 4 times he started up, imagining that a man was approaching his bed for the purpose of stabbing him. Nevertheless, day dawned without darkness having brought any accident. But D'Artagnan well suspected that that which was deferred was not relinquished. D'Artagnan remained all day in his quarters, assigning as a reason to himself that the weather was bad. At 9 o'clock the next morning, the drums beat to arms. The Duc d'Orléans visited the posts, the guards were under arms, and D'Artagnan took his place in the midst of his comrades. Monsieur passed along the front of the line, then all the superior officers approached him to pay their compliments, Monsieur Dessessart, captain of the guards, as well as the others. At the expiration of a minute or two, it appeared to D'Artagnan that Monsieur Dessessart made him a sign to approach. He waited for a fresh gesture on the part of his superior, for fear he might be mistaken. But this gesture being repeated, he left the ranks and advanced to receive orders. "Monsieur is about to ask for some men of good will for a dangerous mission, but one which will do honor to those who shall accomplish it, and I made you a sign in order that you might hold yourself in readiness." "Thanks, my captain," replied D'Artagnan, who wished for nothing better than an opportunity to distinguish himself under the eye of the lieutenant general. In fact, the Rochelle had made a sortie during the night, and had retaken a bastion of which the royal army had gained possession 2 days before. The matter was to ascertain, by reconnoitering, how the enemy guarded this bastion. At the end of a few minutes, Monsieur raised his voice and said, "I want for this mission 3 or 4 volunteers, led by a man who can be depended upon." "As to the man to be depended upon, I have him under my hand, monsieur," said Monsieur Dessessart, pointing to D'Artagnan. "And as to the 4 or 5 volunteers, monsieur has but to make his intentions known,
and the men will not be wanting." "4 men of good will, who will risk being killed with me," said D'Artagnan, raising his sword. 2 of his comrades of the guards immediately sprang forward, and 2 other soldiers having joined them, the number was deemed sufficient. D'Artagnan declined all others, being unwilling to take the first chance from those who had the priority. It was not known whether, after the taking of the bastion, the Rochelle had evacuated it or left a garrison in it. The object then was to examine the place near enough to verify the reports. D'Artagnan set out with his 4 companions and followed the trench. The 2 guards marched abreast with him, and the 2 soldiers followed behind. They arrived thus, screened by the lining of the trench, till they came within 100 paces of the bastion. There, on turning round, D'Artagnan perceived that the 2 soldiers had disappeared. He thought that, beginning to be afraid, they had stayed behind, and he continued to advance. At the turning of the counterscarp, they found themselves within about 60 paces of the bastion. They saw no one, and the bastion seemed abandoned. The 3 composing our forlorn hope were deliberating whether they should proceed any further, when all at once a circle of smoke enveloped the giant of stone, and a dozen balls came whistling around D'Artagnan and his companions. They knew all they wished to know. The bastion was guarded. A longer stay in this dangerous spot would have been useless imprudence. D'Artagnan and his 2 companions turned their backs and commenced a retreat which resembled a flight. On arriving at the angle of the trench, which was to serve them as a rampart, one of the guardsmen fell. A ball had passed through his breast. The other, who was safe and sound, continued his way toward the camp. D'Artagnan was not willing to abandon his companion thus, and stooped to raise him and assist him in regaining the lines. But at this moment 2 shots were fired. One ball struck the head of the already wounded guard, and the other flattened itself against a rock, after having passed within 2 inches of D'Artagnan. The young man turned quickly round, for this attack could not have come from the bastion, which was hidden by the angle of the trench. The idea of the 2 soldiers who had abandoned him occurred to his mind, and with them he remembered the assassins of the 2 evenings before. He resolved this time to know with whom he had to deal, and fell upon the body of his comrade as if he were dead. He quickly saw 2 heads appear above an abandoned work within 30 paces of him. They were the heads of the 2 soldiers. D'Artagnan had not been deceived. These 2 men had only followed for the purpose of assassinating him, hoping that the young man's death would be placed to the account of the enemy. As he might be only wounded and might denounce their crime, they came up to him with the purpose of making sure. Fortunately, deceived by D'Artagnan's trick, they neglected to reload their guns. When they were within 10 paces of him, D'Artagnan, who in falling had taken care not to let go his sword, sprang up close to them. The assassins comprehended that if they fled toward the camp without having killed their man, they should be accused by him. Therefore, their first idea was to join the enemy. One of them took his gun by the barrel and used it as he would a club. He aimed a terrible blow at D'Artagnan, who avoided it by springing to one side, but by this movement he left a passage free to the bandit, who darted off toward the bastion. As the Rochelle who guarded the bastion were ignorant of the intentions of the man they saw coming toward them, they fired upon him, and he fell, struck by a ball which broke his shoulder. Meantime, D'Artagnan had thrown himself upon the other soldier, attacking him with his sword. The conflict was not long. The wretch had nothing to defend himself with but his discharged arquebus. The sword of the guardsman slipped along the barrel of the now useless weapon and passed through the thigh of the assassin, who fell. D'Artagnan immediately placed the point of his sword at his throat. "Oh, do not kill me!" cried the bandit. "Pardon, my officer, and I will tell you all." "Is your secret of enough importance to me to spare your life for it?" asked the young man, withholding his arm. "Yes, if you think existence worth anything to a man of 20 as you are, and who may hope for everything, being handsome and brave as you are." "Wretch!" cried D'Artagnan, "speak quickly. Who employed you to assassinate me?" "A woman whom I don't know, but who is called Milady." "But if you don't know this woman, how do you know her name?" "My comrade knows her. He had called her so. It was with him she agreed, and not with me. He even has in his pocket a letter from that person who attaches great importance to you, as I have heard him say."
"But how did you become concerned in this villainous affair?"
"He proposed to me to undertake it with him, and I agreed."
"And how much did she give you for this fine enterprise?"
100 louis.
"Well, come," said the young man, laughing. "She thinks I am worth something. 100 louis! Well, that was a temptation for two wretches like you. I understand why you accepted it, and I grant you my pardon, but upon one condition."
"What is that?"
said the soldier, uneasy at perceiving that all was not over. "That you will go and fetch me the letter your comrade has in his pocket."
"But," cried the bandit, "that is only another way of killing me. How can I go and fetch that letter under the fire of the bastion?"
"You must nevertheless make up your mind to go and get it, or I swear you shall die by my hand."
"Pardon, monsieur, pity! In the name of that young lady you love, and whom you perhaps believe dead, but who is not!"
cried the bandit, throwing himself upon his knees and leaning upon his hand, for he began to lose his strength with his blood. "And how do you know there is a young woman whom I love, and that I believe that woman dead?" asked D'Artagnan.
"By that letter which my comrade has in his pockets."
"You see, then," said D'Artagnan, "that I must have that letter. So no more delay, no more hesitation, or else whatever may be my repugnance to soiling my sword a second time with the blood of a wretch like you, I swear by my faith as an honest man." And at these words D'Artagnan made so fierce a gesture that the wounded man sprang up.
"Stop! Stop!"
cried he, regaining strength by force of terror.
"I will go! I will go!"
D'Artagnan took the soldier's arquebus, made him go on before him, and urged him toward his companion by pricking him behind with his sword. It was a frightful thing to see this wretch, leaving a long track of blood on the ground as he passed over, pale with approaching death, trying to drag himself along without being seen to the body of his accomplice, which lay 20 paces from him. Terror was so strongly painted on his face, covered with a cold sweat, that D'Artagnan took pity on him, and casting upon him a look of contempt, "Stop," said he. "I will show you the difference between a man of courage and such a coward as you. Stay where you are, I will go myself." And with a light step, an eye on the watch, observing the movements of the enemy, and taking advantage of the accidents of the ground, D'Artagnan succeeded in reaching the second soldier. There were two means of gaining his object, to search him on the spot or to carry him away, making a buckler of his body and searching him in the trench. D'Artagnan preferred the second means, and lifted the assassin onto his shoulders at the moment the enemy fired. A slight shock, the dull noise of 3 balls which penetrated the flesh, a last cry, a convulsion of agony, proved to D'Artagnan that the would-be assassin had saved his life. D'Artagnan regained the trench and threw the corpse beside the wounded man, who was as pale as death. Then he began to search. A leather pocketbook, a purse, in which was evidently a part of the sum which the bandit had received, with a dice box and dice, completed the possessions of the dead man. He left the box and dice where they fell, threw the purse to the wounded man, and eagerly opened the pocketbook. Among some unimportant papers he found the following letter, that which he had sought at the risk of his life. "Since you have lost sight of that woman, and she is now in safety in the convent, which you should never have allowed her to reach, try at least not to miss the man. If you do, you know that my hand stretches far, and that you shall pay very dearly for the 100 louis you have from me." No signature. Nevertheless, it was plain the letter came from Milady. He consequently kept it as a piece of evidence, and being in safety behind the angle of the trench, he began to interrogate the wounded man. He confessed that he had undertaken with his comrade, the same who was killed, to carry off a young woman who was to leave Paris by the Barrière de la Villette. But having stopped to drink at a cabaret, they had missed the carriage by 10 minutes. "But what were you to do with that woman?" asked D'Artagnan with anguish.
"We were to have conveyed her to a hotel in the Place Royale,"
said the wounded man. "Yes, yes," murmured D'Artagnan.
That's the place, Milady's own residence." Then the young man tremblingly comprehended what a terrible thirst for vengeance urged this woman on to destroy him, as well as all who loved him, and how well she must be acquainted with the affairs of the court, since she had discovered all. There could be no doubt she owed this information to the cardinal. But amid all this he perceived, with a feeling of real joy, that the queen must have discovered the prison in which poor Madame Bonacieux was explaining her devotion, and that she had freed her from that prison, and the letter he had received from the young woman and her passage along the road of Chaillot like an apparition were now explained. Then also, as Athos had predicted, it became possible to find Madame Bonacieux, and a convent was not impregnable. This idea completely restored clemency to his heart. He turned toward the wounded man, who had watched with intense anxiety all the various expressions of his countenance, and holding out his arm to him, said, "Come, I will not abandon you thus. Lean upon me, and let us return to the camp." "Yes," said the man, who could scarcely believe in such magnanimity. "But is it not to have me hanged?" "You have my word," said he. "For the second time, I give you your life." The wounded man sank upon his knees to again kiss the feet of his preserver, but D'Artagnan, who had no longer a motive for staying so near the enemy, abridged the testimonials of his gratitude. The guardsman who had returned at the first discharge announced the death of his 4 companions. They were therefore much astonished and delighted in the regiment when they saw the young man come back safe and sound. D'Artagnan explained the sword wound in his companion by a sortie which he improvised. He described the death of the other soldier and the perils they had encountered. This recital was for him the occasion of veritable triumph. The whole army talked of this expedition for a day, and Monsieur paid him his compliments upon it. Besides this, as every great action bears its recompense with it, the brave exploit of D'Artagnan resulted in the restoration of the tranquillity he had lost. In fact, D'Artagnan believed that he might be tranquil, as one of his 2 enemies was killed and the other devoted to his interests. This tranquillity proved one thing, that D'Artagnan did not yet know Milady. End of chapter 41. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.
So, Milady is not kicking back and relaxing on her road to vengeance. She is active and working it. There are so many lines from these 3 chapters that I loved. I just kept writing them down. I was just taking notes on the lines that I liked. Now, one of the things that I didn't catch, and I listened for it over and over again, maybe you caught it. If you did, please let me know, 206-350-1642 or heather@craftlit.com. I couldn't figure out how Constance got the message to D'Artagnan to be on that corner and be watching for her as she flew by in the carriage. I missed that part, but it doesn't really matter. The important thing that we have learned is the same thing that D'Artagnan learned. She is alive. He's figuring out where she probably is, and that's all good. I pretty much just loved everything that came out of Richelieu's mouth. You obey, but too well. At the end of their scene together, I loved his mob boss moment. "Oh, you don't want to join me? Well, unfortunately, I won't be able to protect you. I sure hope nothing bad happens to you." Hint. It was just so Godfather. Don Corleone in a Cardinal's cap. I loved it. I also loved that the lawyer was watching Porthos ride out and was like, "Yeah, I wouldn't be unhappy to see that family member killed in this battle." I also was so happy that we got actual proof, in air quotes, proof that Kitty got out alive, that D'Artagnan didn't basically condemn her to being killed by Milady. She is on the way out. She's going to take Aramis's letters with her, and everybody wins. So that made me happy. I also loved the description that they They made a retreat that resembled a flight. It's not like they were really running for their lives, but they were kind of running for their lives. I love that. I also thought that it was interesting just how much Richelieu knew and how he let D'Artagnan know that he knew. Like, something happened to you. Yes, sir, what actually happened? I know, you had a problem and you lost a letter, didn't you? Well, anyway, mwah, just spectacular. The thing that makes him so interesting is that he's not a villain. In neither scene that we have seen him in, he is not a mustache-twisting villain. He is a manipulator. He is a power player. Both of those things were true of him in real life. But he's letting Milady really be the villain of the story. At this point, we can see that there is some fire burning in her, that when she gets slighted in her mind, or when somebody doesn't do what she needs them to do, like die, she will really go after them. And I thought that last sentence that we ended on, that D'Artagnan just simply does not know Milady, is a good statement to make. There's really only one person in this company who truly knows Milady, and I would even wager that he doesn't know her nearly as well as he thought he did, based on the fact that they are no longer together. And the battle stuff. So the siege of La Rochelle did happen. The important things, like Louis was sick, so they didn't come on the same day as Cardinal Richelieu's troops went and the guards went. That's why D'Artagnan was separated from his friends. All of that was historically true. The idea that the siege, that the whole war was fought because of a romantic jealousy on Richelieu's part, that is just Dumas writing an adventure romance. Because it's a lot more fun to see that as the motivation, especially since Buckingham is involved. It's a lot more fun to see that as the motivation than just, let's get the Calvinists out of our city. That's kind of meh as far as a reason for a war in a book, unless it's about the war. And this book is not about a war. But the other thing I wanted to say about the chapter with the siege, or at least getting the siege in gear, the moment that D'Artagnan tries to get the guy to go into kind of no man's land to get his partner back so that D'Artagnan could get a hold of the letter, my first response was, oh, D'Artagnan, that is just so mean. I mean, yes, the guy tried to kill you, but wow. And then he stops him and says, oh, heck, let somebody who knows how to do this do it. I loved the standing up with the guy on his shoulders and the guy on his shoulders taking the bullet. I don't know if you saw that coming. I had a sneaking suspicion that would happen. I thought that was really great. But it is another one of those moments that I think it would be very easy to look at this book as, oh, that's just something that's in this romanticized, fictionalized world. Nothing like that would ever really happen. And yet, we actually know that they did happen to Alexandre Dumas' dad. This is another one of those moments where you're like, yeah, right. No, actually, yes. That is the kind of thing that Alexandre Dumas' father was known for doing in real life. So kudos to him. And also, D'Artagnan shows himself all throughout these 3 chapters to, I think, be growing into being worthy of being the protagonist. He is smart. He is clever. He does not shirk or hide from anything that he's supposed to do. And that's nice that he's not just a pretty guy who's there to look good with a sword. And I had said before that I wanted to try and play a little clip for you from John Lee's reading of the book. The audio quality is kind of meh, but that doesn't stop John Lee from coming across really, really well. So here we're just going to play you a little clip, a bissel, just a little of John Lee's awesome work.
D'Artagnan bowed with respect. That, continued the Cardinal, arose not only from a feeling of natural equity, but likewise from a plan I have marked out with respect to you. D'Artagnan became more and more astonished. I wished to explain this plan to you on the day you received my first invitation, but you did not come. Fortunately, nothing is lost by this delay, and you are now about to hear it. Sit down there before me, D'Artagnan. You are gentleman enough not to listen standing. And the Cardinal pointed with his finger to a chair for the young man, who was so astonished at what was passing that he awaited a second sign from his interlocutor before he obeyed. You are brave, Monsieur D'Artagnan, continued his Eminence. You are prudent, which is still better. I like men of head and heart. Don't be afraid, said he, smiling. By men of heart, I mean men of courage. But young as you are, and scarcely entering into the world, you have powerful enemies. If you do not take great heed, they will destroy you. Alas, Monseigneur, replied the young man. Very easily, no doubt, for they are strong and well supported, while I am alone. Yes, that's true. But alone as you are, you have done much already, and will do still more, I don't doubt. Yet you have need, I believe, to be guided in the adventurous career you have undertaken. For if I mistake not, you came to Paris with the ambitious idea of making your fortune. I am at the age of extravagant hopes, Monseigneur, said D'Artagnan. There are no extravagant hopes but for fools, monsieur, and you are a man of understanding. Now, what would you say to an ensign's commission in my guards and a company after the campaign? Ah, Monseigneur, you accept it, do you not? Monseigneur, replied D'Artagnan with an embarrassed air. How, you refuse? Cried the Cardinal with astonishment. I am in His Majesty's guards, Monseigneur, and I have no reason to be dissatisfied. But it appears to me that my guards, mine, are also His Majesty's guards, and whoever serves in a French corps serves the king. Monseigneur, your Eminence has ill understood my words. You want a pretext, do you not? I comprehend. Well, you have this excuse. Advancement. The opening campaign. The opportunity which I offer you. So much for the world. As regards yourself, the need of protection. For it is fit you should know, Monsieur D'Artagnan, that I have received heavy and serious complaints against you. You do not consecrate your days and nights wholly to the king's service. D'Artagnan colored. In fact, said the Cardinal, placing his hand upon a bundle of papers, I have here a whole pile which concerns you. I know you to be a man of resolution, and your service is well directed.
I think that is it. I hope you enjoyed these chapters. A lot happened in them. It's funny because every time I listened to the chapters or read along with them as I was listening, I thought, oh, well, those weren't particularly important chapters. And then I really started remembering all the things that happened in them. And they're quite important, especially in setting us up for the next bit. All right, you have a great week. Enjoy World Fountain Pen Day, because it is. And I'm going to be post a little thing on Instagram and letting you know that one way to celebrate World Fountain Pen Day is to go to the Relentlessly Curious Etsy store and take a look at the Madame Defarge Spiral Notebook. I've been really impressed with this. It's spiral bound, so it opens flat. I love that. And it takes ink. Like it actually is fine with the fountain pen. The amount of ghosting on the other side completely depends on how long you let your fountain pen sit on the page. If you're just writing like a normal muggle, you will find that this paper absolutely holds up to fountain pen use. And that is not always true. Rhodia paper is usually pretty good in the, yes, I could afford that arena. Clairefontaine is the paper. If you can afford it, congratulations. That is fabulous paper for you to use for fountain pens. But if you're trying to stay on the lighter side of paper costs, the Madame Defarge Spiral, really, it's a dotted page, so it's got lines in air quotes if you need them. Otherwise, it also is really good to sketch in. The cover it's a really nice feel. Even Aiden, who picked it up at one point, said, "Ooh, I like how that feels." So that is in the Etsy store, and it is certainly something that would help with celebrating World Fountain Pen Day. All right, you take care. I'll talk to you later. Have a good one. Bye. A big thanks to all the CraftLit listeners who support the show by being a premium audio member via craftlit.com/premium or via patreon.com/craftlit. Your support for the show is what's kept us going since 2006. If you feel like getting free audio pretty much every week, please consider supporting the show by heading over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledging what you feel the show is worth to you. If you can't support the show that way, consider leaving a review at iTunes or at our facebook.com/craftlit page, or follow @craftlit on Twitter and share the show with your followers too. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.